everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frater Eleftheria, and over the last year or so I've been very preoccupied with tracing back the roots of my various interests, tracing Western esotericism all the way back as far as I can through history, tracing NHI contact and the history of that as far back as I can, reading various sources that will help me to understand that, and also trying to understand John Dee's true motivation for his angelic workings, which were designed to rediscover the lost knowledge of the prophet Enoch. And in the process of doing this, I've of course tried to understand the times we're living in now, which seem to be a repetition of an end of a cycle that happened in our distant past. And perhaps by understanding that distant past, there are lessons that we can learn for the present and for the future, in fact. These things have been on my mind. They've been in the awareness of other people who have researched various phenomena, and I have been looking into that stuff myself, reaching into the distant past to find an explanation for various things. And as I've done this, I have come to the slow realization, or perhaps remembrance, that all of these various threads converge on a single point. By identifying this convergence point, I feel I will be able to identify the knowledge that has informed the Western esoteric tradition in the subsequent centuries, and in fact millennia. I believe identifying it can also help us to understand the history of NHI contact stretching into humanity's distant past. But I also feel that this knowledge will help me to piece together the various paranormal experiences I've had in my own life involving very different topics like UFO experiences, past life memories, ceremonial magic, and allowing me to combine all of that into a coherent story. And in the same process, by discovering this point of convergence between these various topics, we can help humanity in its own quest for renewal by discovering something that was lost. The point that I'm talking about, the time and place where these various topics converge, is of course the Atlantean civilization that is alleged to have existed in humanity's prehistoric past. But the topic of Atlantis is an incredibly elusive one, and as I set out on this journey to understand Atlantis and put all the pieces of the puzzle together, I wasn't sure if the books or articles that could answer the questions that I had even existed. If I was to find out about Atlantis, I needed to have an unconventional approach. So that obviously implies some spiritual or magical technique, but I knew I also had to be careful because there's a lot of woo-woo around this topic, and I knew I needed to be discerning with any new information that I came across. But admittedly, there wasn't very much to work with, and I kind of had to work with what I had. So I made the decision I wanted to find out more about Atlantis. But then I realized the only real breadcrumb that I had to follow was looking into the alleged Atlantean crystals that proponents of the New Age love to talk about. So other signs in my spiritual life have indicated that I have a strong connection with these crystals, that I had at least one past life in Atlantis where I interacted with these crystals in some way. And so I thought that by reconnecting with that past life and the theme of the crystals, which seemed to touch upon the ballpark of what I was trying to find out, I could get the information that I was looking for. And I had quite vivid dreams about a great Atlantean crystal when I was a teenager, so I thought that it would be a good thread to follow for that reason. So I went down the rabbit hole of trying to understand these Atlantean crystals, particularly the famous Firestone that Edgar Cayce spoke about. Whether or not that was a real prophecy or the information that was channeled was any good is another question. But this is the thread that I was following, And it eventually led me to contemporary crystal law and looking into some of the uses of crystals in contemporary spirituality which connect with the Atlantean story somehow. And that's when I found out about something called a record keeper crystal. Now, a record keeper, according to crystal law, is not just any crystal. It's got these little etchings on it. There's little triangular etchings on its faces. And this is supposed to indicate that some kind of knowledge has been encoded into the crystal, or you can use the crystal to access said knowledge, whether you understand that as being from the Akashic records or knowledge of particular civilizations such as Atlantis. You're supposed to be able to access it through one of these record keepers. So I decided I needed to find a record keeper as my first step in my journey of discovery of Atlantis. And, I've got a lot of stuff lying around. Not all of it is stuff that I fully understand the significance of. And I just wondered if I might have a record keeper among the various crystals that I have. And sure enough, I did. So it turns out that when I was studying Reiki, my Reiki master, who's now deceased, Master Trav, may he rest in peace, he gave me a whole bunch of crystals. He would just, throw crystals at me constantly to take home. And there was this one bit of quartz that he gave me, which I wasn't too fussed about when I got it at first. It just seemed like another bit of quartz. And this is it here. And upon closer inspection, I found that this is in fact a record keeper on at least one of its faces. This one here. You probably can't see it, but there's very small triangles etched into the face. I have no idea if you're going to be able to actually see that. So this is my record keeper, and it's just incredible because these are apparently very rare and exceptional crystals, and I just had one lying around because my Reiki master just gave it to me without knowing what it was. And the thing that makes this story even more incredible is that Master Trav also came into my life because of the entities that take the form of light orbs and communicate with people telepathically. So Master Trav's deal was that quite some years ago now, he actually had 18 cardiac arrests in hospital, and he was clinically not alive for a period of time. And during that time, he had an out-of-body experience in which these orbs of light, which kind of contained, well, they weren't really orbs, they were like these shifting geometric shapes made of light, appeared before him and started communicating with him and told him, they basically coached him on how to give himself Reiki to bring himself back, which he did remarkably, and then went on in the subsequent years to meet me and take me on as a student and teach me various things, Reiki chief amongst them, but also he passed this crystal on to me. And so that's how it made its way to me. So the way that I got it is in its own right very auspicious. So I decided I was going to use this as a kind of talisman, charged with meaning from my own life and how I received it, and also the surrounding crystal lore about record keepers. I was going to use this and come up with a little meditation ritual to channel the information that I could about Atlantis through this record keeper. So that's what I did. I did my banishings. I went into a meditation holding the record keeper in my hand, and then let the information flow. And flow it did. And tonight I'm going to tell you exactly what I was able to channel from the record keeper. It's going to be like a bit of a stream of consciousness at times, and I'll need to pause at various points so I can talk about how I corroborated certain information, but I'll summarize the findings at the end. And so basically, the record keeper did in fact tell me about Atlantis, how the light beings, the NHIs, interacted with the Atlantean civilization, and it told me about how much of the Western esoteric tradition can be traced back to that civilization as well. There's been a lot of speculation about this civilization. You know, everything from it was just a little island, like the island of Crete or something equivalent to that, all the way to it was this world-spanning empire where they had flying machines and nuclear power. And I was expecting maybe an Egyptian theme to come through, or perhaps, you know, something like that to come through. But in fact, what the record keeper showed me was something very different. One of the first things that I got from the channeling was to look to the legend of the Tuat de Danann, particularly as it relates to Druidry. And if I could look to the Tuat de Danann, then I would understand what the Atlantean civilization really was. And then I was shown like a pyramid, and I got told that the first pyramid, so-called, was not an Egyptian pyramid at all, but in fact a burial mound with an outer encasing of stones. And so we had these burial mounds, which were like a more primitive form of pyramid, that were built by the Atlantean civilization, and this more primitive mound structure evolved into the later pyramids of the Egyptians and ziggurats of the Sumerians. These pyramid-like structures of the Atlanteans were both tombs and temples, places where the soul can deposit its body while it journeys to the stars, using the structure as a way of getting closer to the heavens because it kind of goes up like that, and also by the way that it's aligned, focusing the soul on a particular destination in the heavens. So the knowledge of the Atlantean civilization, I was told, was indeed passed down to Egypt and Sumeria. And then the last thing that I was told to look at was to look at the myths of the origins of the Greek language, the Hebrew language, and the runes, and look for the commonality in those myths. There was other things that I was told about the NHIs as well, but that's too much of an information dump for one night, I think. So let's just pause there. That was the first lot of information that I was given on Atlantis, and there was a little bit for me to corroborate there. So let's have a look at that. What's this business about the Tuat de Danann? Well, there's an answer to that, and it also relates to this idea of the burial mounds as well. So Ireland has these very old megalithic burial mounds. New Grange is probably the typical example of that. New Grange actually predates the pyramids, which is something I didn't know until I started investigating this topic further. But anyway, we have these burial mounds, very mysterious. The native Gaels of Ireland had a number of legends about how these megalithic structures came to be, which were already there when they arrived to Ireland in the distant past. There's a legend that the Tuat de Danann, beings called the Tuat de Danann, had actually built these structures. And it's a truly fascinating legend. Basically, the Tuat de Danann were a mysterious people. Some sources say they were gods. Some say they were human beings. They seem to kind of blur the line between those two categories a bit. But these people were among the first inhabitants of Ireland, not necessarily the first, according to legend. But they arrived in Ireland from mythical islands somewhere else via a boat, or in some accounts by materializing or traveling on a cloud or materializing out of a cloud or something along those lines. The Tuat de Danann were regarded as skilled druids or magicians, you might say. They are said to be the ones who built the mounds, such as Newgrange, and when the Gaels or the Milesians arrived at Ireland and went to war with the Tuat de Danann to take control of Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann retreated into these mounds. In addition, these mounds are regarded as portals to the other world. And so according to legend, the Tuatha Dé Danann, when they entered their mounds, transformed into the fairies. And to this day, there are reports of people encountering strange lights and other phenomena around these mounds. And such accounts stretch back a very long time. And if passage to Magonia is anything to go by, I think Jacques Vallée would certainly have something to say about how this is related to the UFO phenomenon as it was recorded in our past. But it's very interesting to see how we have these legendary people who in prehistory build these megalithic structures. They are an advanced civilization in their own right, and they seem through access to these fairy forts, they seem to have the ability to shift between a human form and transforming into a non-human intelligence which takes the form of a light being. But hold that thought. So that's the legend of the Tuatha Dé Danann, who built the burial mounds. But today, remarkably, we actually know more about the people who did build those mounds. They are a group that is often referred to as Anatolian farmers who left Anatolia in Neolithic times and arrived in very early history in Ireland as well, about 4000 BC, if I recall correctly. This group did indeed come from Anatolia during Neolithic times, and they were farmers, but that description doesn't do them justice, because they knew how to build megalithic sites as well, and these sites were aligned with specific astronomical phenomena, solstices, things like that. And Stonehenge was another one of the monuments that was built by them. Very sophisticated astronomical and astrological significance to the placement of those stones, even though it's in humanity's distant past. And if you go back to the culture that was the source of these people, the Anatolia of Neolithic times, they were doing some pretty wild stuff there as well, and doing it thousands of years before civilization was supposed to have begun, according to mainstream archaeology. We've got an important thing to grasp onto now. Atlantis is related to Neolithic Anatolia, Anatolia in the distant past, the very distant past. Another interesting thing to consider is that there is one theory out there that Plato's Atlantis is really just an allegory for Troy, which again leads us back to Anatolia, which of course is where Troy was located. To spell this out a bit more, there are many parallels between Troy and Atlantis. Atlantis is involved in a big maritime war with the Greeks, as indeed Troy was in Plato's account, is involved in this war. It is said to be beyond a site that was known in the ancient world as the Pillars of Hercules. Most people associate the Pillars of Hercules with the Straits of Gibraltar, but there was another site linked to Troy, in the area near Troy, which is also described as the Pillars of Hercules. According to the account of Isocrates, the city of Troy was an advanced civilization that suddenly fell. But most interesting of all is when we consider the origins of the term Atlantis. Now, today, because of all of the connotations and everything else, when people think of Atlantis, they think of some sunken city somewhere, like in The Little Mermaid or something. The word Atlantis has a specific meaning which communicates its true import. And what Atlantis actually means is from Atlas or of Atlas. And the reason for this was because the Atlanteans were supposed to have come from Atlas in some way, the Titan in Greek mythology. And the Trojan royalty traced their origins from the Titan Atlas. They traced their descent from him. So the Trojans were considered Atlanteans in the very literal sense of who they regarded themselves as descending from. And so it's probable that the features of Atlantis that are in Plato's writings were in fact alluding to the story of Troy. And given these associations, it's very interesting that the city of Troy is located in the same place in the world as the Neolithic civilization of Anatolia and can probably be regarded as the continuation of that civilization in some sense. There's a lot of interesting little threads all pointing to the same thing now. But there was something else that I was told to look into when I used a record keeper, and that was the various language origin myths. What was I able to find about this? Well, let's consider the Hebrew language first. The origin of that language is said to have been given by God to Adam as the sacred language for naming creation. The Greeks claim to have gotten their alphabet from Cadmus, who was in turn the grandson of a king of Egypt. So linking the Greek alphabet back to Egypt, and the Egyptians claimed in turn that their writing was invented by the god Thoth and then given to humanity. The runes come from Odin, who is said to have sacrificed himself on the world tree to gain divine knowledge, and the end result of Odin's 9 days hanging on the world tree was receiving the vision of the runes and then writing them down. And so in every case we see there is a process of divine revelation or revelation from a god that transmits that writing to humanity. And on an interesting side note, all these alphabets, Hebrew, Greek, and the runes, originate from the same alphabet, the same earlier alphabet, namely Phoenician. Phoenician in turn goes further back to originating from Proto-Sinaitic, which at least the figures of that language, the letters of that language were inspired by Egyptian hieroglyphs and ultimately Sumerian influences on the development of language, or of written language. With the very beginning of these alphabets fading into prehistory in the Neolithic Near East, the Levant, Sumer, and Anatolia. And since I was told that the knowledge of this Atlantean civilization made its way into Egypt and Sumeria, it's also interesting to see how there are features of the culture of Neolithic Anatolia that seem to be echoed in later Egyptian civilization, combining a fascination with astronomy, giant stone monuments, and the afterlife. So for instance, Göbekli Tepe, which is a site dating back to between 9,500 and 8,000 BC, consists of megalithic structures which in all likelihood were used for astronomical observation, although we don't know precisely how just yet. And then you've got another site in Neolithic Anatolia known as Çatalhöyük, which dates between 7,400 and 6,200 BC, where it was built in such a way that the deceased were buried under where their descendants lived, so that the people who were in the world of the living were constantly in contact with the afterlife, with the spirit of their ancestors, and that was really woven into the fabric of their society in a way that we didn't see in other societies. So those are just some interesting little things as well. Kind of reminds me of the obsession with immortality or the afterlife that we see in ancient Egypt later on, and arguably Sumeria as well, with Gilgamesh's quest for immortality. So we've got something interesting emerging now. But I needed more information, so I did further sessions with the record keeper. And here's the additional information that I was given. The record keeper confirmed my view that the NHIs first communicated with human beings during shamanic style rituals, and they used the language of symbol to do that. And these symbols were recorded, and this became the basis of the first written languages. The Atlantean written language was a series of petroglyphs. That's what I got from the record keeper. And these petroglyphs formed the basis of other languages. And this particular set of Atlantean petroglyphs contained a code for symbolically understanding the universe. Very similar to something like, say, the Hebrew alphabet. Perhaps this is the origin point of that idea. I was told that the Atlanteans did indeed use crystals and gemstones not to power big machines like a futuristic civilization or something like that, but rather to focus spiritual energy and to bring divine favor. And this bit of information was corroborated by later research when I found out that in some of these Anatolian sites, there are people buried with gemstones in graves. So different gems were significant to these people. And also some of these gems were traded with the Neolithic Sumerians, who engraved them with different symbols. And these became a series of protective amulets, which became the basis of written language later on, which I'll get into later in this video. So all very interesting. I was told that the Atlantean civilization existed during the last golden age, or at least part of it occurred during the last golden age. And the reason we are so desperate to reconnect with Atlantis is because we want the return of the golden age. The record keeper confirmed that ancient Anatolia, or rather Neolithic Anatolia, was the location of the Atlantean civilization. The record keeper then expanded on this by saying that there was a sense in which Neolithic Anatolia and Neolithic Sumeria were loosely part of the same culture, and this culture, this loosely connected culture, was the Atlantean culture. And I later corroborated this as well with research into the so-called pre-pottery Neolithic period, lasting from 10,000 to 6,500 BC, which covered much of the Fertile Crescent. And it stretched all the way down the Tigris and the Euphrates River, up towards the top of Syria and the bottom of Anatolia, and then back down again into the Levant, what is today Lebanon and Israel. And I was also told that the Atlantean civilization was the civilization where we made a specific type of contact with NHIs, which amounts to a kind of contract. They will give us knowledge, and in exchange we will use that knowledge not only to benefit ourselves, but to transform ourselves into light beings. In other words, to become what they themselves are. And this seems to be the way that these beings proliferate their form of life. We're like an earlier form of their life cycle. Us and other organisms like us, we become them. We're trying to impress our consciousness onto that subtle level of reality, into that energetic structure to become them. And when I received the information about this mysterious contract, I was also given the message to look to the biblical story of Noah and the pre-flood civilization for confirmation of this. So I'll come back to this and what I found when I corroborated this. So first of all, talking about corroborating these latest messages, I did find that this civilization that is being labelled the Atlantean civilization is indeed the origin of much of the written languages of the world today. Certainly those which are sacred in the Western esoteric tradition, such as the Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Hebrew letters, the Greek letters, and in fact Sumerian cuneiform script. The origin of that is in the area incorporating Sumeria and Anatolia and that kind of Fertile Crescent area. And it looks like, as way out as it seems, that the origin of this language can be attributed in some sense to NHI contact. So this is something that I need to explain a bit further. First of all, the way that the glyphs of this earlier civilization, the Atlanteans, made its way to Sumerian and Egyptian. If you look at the earliest Egyptian hieroglyphs and the earliest glyphs of proto-cuneiform, you start to see a lot of the same symbols repeating themselves, like the head of an ox, which represents godlike power. There's also a number of other symbols they have in common. And some of these symbols also appear in things like the Göbekli Tepe monument. You know, they had a serpent there that appears in the Sumerian and Egyptian glyphs. They have a human being standing like that. The figure of a human being appears as well in Egyptian and Sumerian glyphs. So there does seem to be some connection there based on the scant information we already have in the development of these early alphabets. And what's interesting is the symbolism of the ox head as being, you know, the alpha, quite literally, the first letter of the alphabet, representing some kind of supreme ideal of power. Because in Çatalhöyük, we see the use of Bucrania quite regularly within households. Bucrania are like a display of an ox head or a bull's head as a symbol of power. A very ancient symbol dating all the way back to these Anatolian Neolithic sites. So once again, the bull's head or the ox's head representing supreme power. And interestingly, Plato describes the Atlanteans as having a bull worshipping cult as well. And then in the prehistory of Sumeria, we see that in the 6th millennium BC, in Sumeria, but also in Syria, the symbols that would make their way into proto-cuneiform started making their way onto stamp seals, these things called stamp seals, which were often engraved gemstones obtained through trade with Anatolia. And these seals had a little design on them, you know, like the signet ring that you put in the wax to indicate ownership of a particular thing that's being transported. These seals, in addition to having an administrative purpose like that for transporting goods, were also intended as protective amulets that would invoke or banish a particular type of spiritual entity to allow for the safe transport of those goods with magical means. So what that means then is whoever came up with these seals, these stamp seals going back to the 6th millennium BC, had to have had some kind of interaction with a spirit being, what we would today describe as a non-human intelligence. And then as a consequence of that interaction in some way, whether through direct communication or just reacting to that experience, developed a way to reproduce contact with certain types of spirits. And that was in a talismanic symbolic form, and that became the basis of written language. So quite literally, NHIs gave us writing. And as someone who is an experiencer and somebody who has practiced esotericism and magic for nearly 20 years, I know that these beings are not just superstition from the past, they're very real. And it seems that they influenced the development of our written language. And so in order to get there, the idea of NHIs visiting us in the distant past to jumpstart our civilization in some way, you don't need ridiculous theories of like ancient aliens, like a UFO coming down, like a flying disc with space people from another planet coming down and using its anti-gravity beam to lift up big limestone blocks to build a pyramid while the cavemen sat there scratching their head because human beings are too dumb to figure out engineering for themselves. No, you don't have to go to that goofy scenario to understand what's going on here, to understand the nature of historic NHI contact and its consequences. And it all has to do with experiences in consciousness, ultimately. So another part of the story that I was encouraged to look into was, of course, the story of Noah and the pre-flood civilization, which is also covered by the Book of Enoch, which gives some good supplementary details. It's the story of the watchers coming down and giving certain knowledge to humanity, but it's also the story of the prophet Enoch speaking with other kinds of angels and getting other kinds of spiritual knowledge and scientific knowledge, and Enoch being taken up into heaven and transformed into one of the angelic host, much the same way perhaps as the Tuatha Dé Danann were transformed to fairies when they passed into the other world, There's something being alleged in the Book of Enoch, though, that we can prove, that we can verify with evidence. That is to say, alleging certain things happened, and we can find out when in time and space they actually happened. So we're being told specifically about the beginnings of metallurgy, we're being told about the beginnings of jewellery and dyeing, that is to say, dyeing clothes, and that being attributed to intervention from non-human intelligences, in this case the Watchers. And the beginnings of astronomy and astrology were also attributed to intervention from non-human intelligences. In some cases good, in some cases bad, depending on what that knowledge is used for. And as it turns out, we can trace the origins of all of these things back to the pre-pottery Neolithic period in the same area, the Fertile Crescent, and also the earliest possible astronomical observation site being Göbekli Tepe being built there, but that research is of course still unfolding. And also within the same zone of interlaced, interacting Neolithic cultures in the pre-pottery Neolithic Fertile Crescent, we also have Mount Hermon, which is where the Watchers were said to have descended down and first made the agreement to start interacting with the human race. So that's very interesting as well. Naturally, this would also be the time and place where Enoch interacted with various angels and where he was eventually taken up. But of course, the other part of that story is the Great Flood. What are we to make of the Great Flood and its historicity? Because we've spoken a lot about the features of what the Atlantean civilization would have been, but what about that great disaster that's supposed to have engulfed it, which is reflected in the story of the flood in the Bible as well as in the Epic of Gilgamesh? Well, there were actually several floods throughout history, and in fact very early history of civilizations in the area. Alluvial sediment has been found in several archaeological layers while excavating Sumerian cities. It's quite possible that there were several floods and that this flood myth was based on not a worldwide deluge necessarily, but a lot of little floods that happened, and just the universal archetype of the flood as being a great disaster, because it was something that universally happened to a lot of different ancient cultures and was devastating in its impact, and floods are still devastating to this day. So it became a bit of a universal archetype. Not in Egypt though, there was no flood story in Egypt, interestingly, because the flooding of the Nile is actually an important part of the cycles of the land and brought fertility rather than destruction. So that's an interesting tidbit there. So it's very likely that this Neolithic civilization in the Fertile Crescent area would have experienced devastating cataclysmic floods at various points in its history as well. And perhaps that would have been interpreted as punishment from the gods for being too prideful or something along those lines. And then when you consider that, we've got all the features of a candidate for the Atlantean civilization. So, to put all this together, the information from the record keeper indicated that the pre-pottery Neolithic farmers from Anatolia and the surrounding areas were a sophisticated civilization in their own right, who made use of crystals as a kind of talismanic spiritual tool, whose unique culture represented a shift towards primitive petroglyphic writing as a sacred language of power and mapping the cosmos, and to a shift to megalithic sites based on astronomical knowledge, and a shift towards spiritual technologies that attempted to bridge the divide between this world and the spirit world like never before. Megalithic temple-type structures, often incorporating some kind of connection to the afterlife, as well as to the stars, of course. This civilization spread out around the Neolithic world, out from the Fertile Crescent to particularly Europe, and was ultimately responsible for building Stonehenge, as well as the so-called fairy forts of Ireland. And the sacred mysteries of this civilization became the basis of the Western esoteric traditions via Egypt and Sumeria, which were both influenced by this earlier Atlantean culture. What's more, the innovations of this civilization that made it unique came about as the result of NHI contact, and that contact has been memorialized in various myths of the ancient world. This civilization came to be associated with the Trojan city and its demise. It came also to be associated with various floods that happened in humanity's distant prehistory. That is my take on the Atlantean civilization, based on the little bits of information I was given by the record keeper and the subsequent research I did to corroborate that. I have full faith in the information I have received, and I expect that in the coming decades, archaeology will start to catch up and confirm much of what I have just outlined about the Atlantean civilization. And really, rediscovering Atlantis allows us to rediscover a time of wonder, a time when we were closer to the divine, closer to the spirit world. And it was about a time that we remember as a golden age as well. You know, without living under some of the difficulties that we've come to associate with agricultural civilization. And you know, it's worth noting that Çatalhöyük shows us that that particular society was very egalitarian, very non-hierarchical, and there seems to be a very different structure to that society versus something like the top-down, very hierarchical, rigid, later agricultural societies, where you've got domination of the rest of the population by a ruling elite. Sites like Çatalhöyük, which are associated with this Atlantean civilization, in my theorem, show us that there is a different way to do civilization that doesn't involve being dominated by a parasitic elite. And perhaps that is the reason why the mainstream is so terrified of us looking into our distant past, looking at the origins of civilization beyond the Sumerian priest kings and their rise to power. And it's interesting to consider the role of NHIs in all of this, in the very origins of human civilization. And who knows, we might also hear something from Trump in the next few weeks that could corroborate some of what I've revealed tonight, if this supposed UFO disclosure that's coming is all it's cracked up to be. But we'll see. In the meantime, I hope that you enjoyed this video on Atlantis, a very different take to what you've probably heard before, but I think a very refreshing one, and one which will bring us hopefully closer to the truth. If you did enjoy this video, please leave a like, subscribe to my channel to support my work, hit join or thanks to support me further, leave any comments you have down below, and I also want you to go to the link below and join my mailing list, because there's a lot of other things I'll announce on there which you might not see on YouTube. So go check that out as well. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.